Hello everyone, and welcome to this session on neurodiversity, apprentices and preventing dropout. I'm Dr. Louise Kowalski, Director of Education at Cognition. In this session, we're going to give you an introduction to neurodiversity and inclusion, explore why it's good for people, companies and society at large, before sharing how to implement a neurodiversity and inclusion strategy in your own business. We'll give you an introduction to the main concepts that we focus on at Cognition. The first of which is neurodiversity. And I'll talk a little bit about what it actually means to think differently and how it plays a key role in education. Then we'll discuss cognition, the 8 key cognitive domains, and how this impacts our lives. We'll finish off with a look at what this means for organisations and learners. Some attendees today might be already familiar with these concepts, but we've got some good examples and insights to keep things interesting. So let's get straight to it. Neurodiversity is an inclusive term that acknowledges everybody's mind is different. Not only are our brains all physically different, but we also process information differently. It's not about being better or worse, it is just different. And embracing neurodiversity in education is about acknowledging these differences, adapting to them, and making sure that thinking differently does not put that learner at a disadvantage. We know that with the right support, learners who might typically struggle in education can achieve alongside their peers. And this diversity of thinking comes with a lot of benefits. It's good to have a team of people who all think differently and can approach problems from different angles. And supporting neurodiversity in education has this ripple effect into the working world. Employers want to know how they can best support their employees. And creating an inclusive working culture doesn't have to start on the job. It can start with learning itself. The phrase, "we all think and learn differently," feels very intuitive. We all live different lives with different experiences, and every one of our brains is unique. But this also means it is very hard for us to know what someone else's experience is actually like. We only have one frame of reference, and we're living in it every day of our lives. And often, we're not that great at knowing what our own experience is like. That's why learning needs can be hard to identify and can go hidden well into adulthood. Some of you listening will identify as having a learning difference. Some of you might know this already. You might have a formal diagnosis, or you might even have taken the Cognition assessment already. But those of you sitting there thinking, well, it couldn't possibly be me, I want to challenge that. Different learning needs come with a stigma attached sometimes. That it means somebody has lower intelligence or they're bad at learning certain subjects. And this is not the case. People with different learning needs can be highly motivated and skilled individuals. Our CEO, Chris Quickfall, is dyslexic. He's founded 4 companies, and his work has helped change the lives of thousands of learners across the country. There aren't any limits on what people who think differently can achieve. And as a society, we need to get better at talking about this in the right way and supporting people who think differently to rely on their strengths rather than focusing on the difficulties they may have. So how does this relate to education? I think it shows that we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. And we need to make sure that thinking differently isn't a disadvantage, but of benefit, like it's perceived in the working world. That people who might struggle with education and learning are more empowered to learn and to learn effectively. And that we have robust, data-driven support in place that helps tutors and staff to do this. There are things that we can all do differently, but it's about knowing where to start and having the confidence to know that you're doing the right thing. And that comes from understanding your learners, whether it's through a cognitive assessment or a conversation with that learner. It's about being willing to discuss your support provision up front, showing that you're an inclusive organisation through an active culture and community and your own actions. And from our perspective, the way to understand your learners is to know how they think and learn. So let's continue the conversation into cognition. Cognition is a technical word that we use to describe some of the many things that we do, or our mind does, in order to interact effectively with the world around us. To be more specific, we're talking about the processes relating to perceiving, thinking, and learning. It can be useful to use an everyday example to describe what we mean. So let's think about the process of learning to drive. Before driving becomes more automatic, it can be a very cognition-heavy task. First, we have to accurately, visually perceive what is happening all around us in order to stay in a lane, look for hazards, judge distance, speed, and so on. Then we have to think about what to actually do. We make decisions about where to go, read road signs, follow maps or GPS instruction, reason about the behaviour of other people and their movements. And we also need to learn a lot about road rules, what to do when you break down, as well as legal obligations like tax and insurance. These are all examples of cognition. And hopefully you can see that these kinds of processes are relevant to pretty much everything we do in our waking lives. We're all different in terms of these cognitive capacities, or domains, as we call them. So what actually causes these differences between us? Science has made a lot of progress to help us understand the answer to this question. Decades of psychological science has shown a large, complex group of factors interacting that influence our cognition, such as genetics, our environment, our childhood development, our culture, our education, and our age, to name a few. Now, if you take a moment to think about this list of influences, you might notice that they're mostly outside of our personal control. I'd like you to remember this point because I'll come back to it in a moment. The things that affect our cognition are mostly outside of our personal control. The concept of neurodiversity is used to make sure that we remember the positive aspects about the fact that we all think differently and the advantages that neurodiversity brings to society. Historically, discussing cognitive differences has only been in the context of problems rather than advantages. But to be a truly innovative and effective society, we should all be able to bring our unique perspective of the world forward for collaboration with each other. Let's touch on the good bits and the challenging bits for a moment. Neurodiversity can influence our lives in three broad ways. First, neurodiversity and cognitive differences can give us an advantage. Let's say you struggle with language. Writing just isn't your bag. This might mean that you're good at visualizing abstract concepts or problem solving with physical objects. This might give you an advantage as an engineer, mechanic, or an architect. You may be able to see problems from a different perspective that make your job easier. We know that some companies specifically hire people based on their differences from their existing workforce rather than similarity. Second, cognitive differences might be neutral in that they don't give a good or bad influence on our lives. Second, cognitive differences might be neutral in that they don't have a good or bad influence on our lives. But third, and one of the main reasons why we at Cognisis do what we do, is because sometimes these differences can make things harder in our lives. For example, if you naturally struggle with numbers, you may experience difficulties in school, which might affect further education, career choices, income, and so on. This brings us to why it actually matters. You'll have to allow me to get a little bit serious for a moment. I want to stress my next point because it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. I really care about this stuff, so I want to make you care if you don't already. You might have noticed that we live in a society with a fair amount of inequality. The types of cognitive differences in the third category I just mentioned, as in the differences that can cause things to be more difficult, can have important impacts on our individual lives. Decades of research has shown that cognitive differences can influence our experience in education, family life, social life, health outcomes, incomes, and even lifespan. I asked you to remember a point I made earlier. The point that things which influence our own cognition fall mostly outside of our personal control. Let me use myself as an example. I'm pretty good with numbers. I'm certainly not Brian Cox, but I'm okay. I don't mean I'm highly trained or that I've practiced a lot. I mean that even when I was at school, I naturally had a decent knack with numbers. I'm sure that this knack made some of my schooling easier. I'm also sure that it helped me when studying science at university. And it certainly helped me to get a job that I love at Cognisis that requires a good amount of data analysis and statistics. But how much credit can I claim for this knack if it was influenced by things outside of my control? Not much. I can't claim much credit for something I didn't choose. The other side of this coin means that negative life outcomes that can be influenced by differences in cognition, that are themselves influenced by things outside of our control, like culture and genetics, cannot be blamed on the individual. Unfortunately, our society can indirectly and unintentionally punish these differences. After all, having barriers in school is a bad thing. Having a lower income because of it is a bad thing. As part of civilized society, we have a moral obligation to reduce these types of indirect punishments. The good news is that you can help do something about it. We are getting better and better at identifying people that might need more support because of these differences, so that we can make sure they don't fall through the cracks. We know that some education providers that we work with achieve a 100% completion rate with learners that have a higher risk of experiencing the kind of difficulties that we've been discussing. You can help. We're not talking about making qualification requirements less rigorous or giving handouts. We're talking about making the education environment more flexible by working with people's differences rather than trying to squeeze people into the same mould. You might have gathered that cognition is very complex. So how could we possibly measure it? Interestingly, we can measure complex things like this with simple tools. Let's step outside of cognition for a moment and use eyesight as an example. Our eyes are very complex, and our visual world is even more complex. But we can get a pretty good idea about how well you can see by asking you to look at letters that decrease in size and maybe a few flashing lights. Cognition is measured in a similar way. We ask you to complete straightforward tasks that we know require the same cognitive tools as important real-world activities like thinking and learning. We measure 8 key cognitive domains for thinking and learning. Some relate to verbal information, some to memory, some to visual information, and some relate to attention. I want to give you a brief introduction to them, and if you want to know more, you can look into our resources on our website. It's important to remember that these domains can impact each other and can be related in complex ways. They're not always completely separate from each other, but they do describe different processes. Sometimes we get asked about learning styles. Measuring cognition and using what are called learning styles are quite different things. We're not talking about the same thing here. Some of our audience might be surprised to learn that learning styles actually have very little scientific basis. If you're not familiar with the idea, learning styles use questionnaires to try and get at whether somebody is a verbal learner, a visual learner, a kinesthetic learner, and so on. The concept has a couple of problems. First, questionnaires that are usually used ask things about a person's experience. Questionnaires themselves are limited, and these simply might suggest preferences, but not actually what's effective for that person in their learning. The second is that the concept and these questionnaires don't fit with our scientific evidence. The mark of good science is that it helps us explain what we observe in the world. We can use it to understand and predict relationships. A person's score on a learning style quiz doesn't help us explain or predict anything. Cognition, on the other hand, is actually measuring important aspects of our thinking and learning, and has been shown to predict things related to education, careers, and other life outcomes that we've already mentioned. The good news is that if you are using learning styles questionnaires, you are on the right track. Your intention is in the right place, as you likely want to make things more adaptive for your learners. Measuring cognition is a more informative way of doing this. So what does this all mean for your learners and their journey through education and life? Understanding neurodiversity and really understanding what it means to think differently can make education more adaptive, and it makes all of us more compassionate. And by measuring cognition, we can help to identify and support learners who might otherwise struggle in education. And it's not always easy to identify these learners and know what support would benefit them the most. The purpose of this session today is to help you and your organisation in this journey, even if you don't have access to a cognitive assessment for your learners. Dropout rates are the most persistent problem facing the apprenticeship sector today. Regardless of specialism, be it hairdressing, construction or accountancy, dropout rates are one of the most significant barriers to achievement. Here's the proof. Currently, 35% of all apprentices drop out. Whilst non-completers left for a variety of reasons, it is important to acknowledge that a significant number were driven to drop out by poor quality provision, says the DFE. Now, if we are serious about levelling up skills and providing a lifetime skills guarantee, we need to ensure every apprentice receives the same high quality experience and an equal opportunity of success. Especially now, with a widening disadvantage gap, we must provide greater support and opportunities for those at risk of dropping out. According to the National Achievement Rates tables, learners with identified learning difficulties and/or disabilities are more likely to drop out of their apprenticeship. The higher dropout rate for LDD apprentices is even more disheartening, because this data also shows that when LDD learners are retained, they have the same pass rate as learners without needs. We've released a handbook to help the sector address the high levels of dropout within apprenticeships. Please visit our social pages or website to get the link. What this insight helps people to do is understand how they think and learn, to make education more inclusive and the supports we provide more personalised. Make better decisions about the ways we support learners and help them to make better decisions about themselves, about their learning and future goals. And all this is aimed to improve life outcomes, to improve well-being, income potential and confidence for individuals, whether it's learners or staff. The journey to understanding neurodiversity is one that we have to take together. And finally, just to recap, we talked about neurodiversity and what it actually means to think differently. We covered cognition, which is how we actually process information and how neurodiversity can affect our cognition. Most importantly, we want to help when it affects our learning negatively and work around that to support learners. And how we do that is through understanding the 8 key cognitive domains to support individuals in specific areas of learning. Understanding neurodiversity and cognition is very much a process. Not many of us have PhDs in this stuff. But by learning about these concepts, and even just attending this session, is going to help you and your learners in this process. And hopefully it gives you some new information that you can try and apply in your organisation. Thank you.